Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the HyperTough 80213 12-volt 3-mode laser level. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, starting off at the bottom of the tool, we have the tripod mount, and it's a pretty standard tripod design mount. It takes the 1/4 inch instead of the larger 3/8 inch hole, which is pretty much the standard in today's world. It used to be the older 3/8 inch that was much more standard, but in today's world, you know, everything's a 1/4 inch, and, you know, for the most part, it's a pretty good showing here. Now, the bottom of the tool is mostly flat, but there is some rubberized texture on each of the corners that kind of wraps down and around, so if the screw on your tripod plate is incredibly short, you may have an issue getting it fully seated into the laser. I haven't had any issues with the Swiss Arca style that I've been using, and everything seems to work just fine. So, you know, really no complaints there. I do recommend getting a ball head tripod for use with this particular laser, or pretty much any laser, just because they're a lot easier to work with if your ground is uneven. If all you're doing is using this indoors and you don't have to worry about your, you know, floor being uneven, you can get away with a regular tripod, but, you know, for a lot of different circumstances, a ball head tripod is just easier to work with. So with that being said, I don't really have any complaints, and everything here passes. So with that said, let's move on. Okay, moving on to the body of the laser itself. For the most part, it's a pretty good showing here. The body is mainly made out of plastic, but there is quite a bit of rubberized texture or rubber that's been wrapped around the body of the laser in order to protect it if you were to drop it, although I would not recommend that just because, well, dropping any sort of measuring device that is sensitive to falls is just not a good idea. Now, the front of the laser does have a clear cover that goes over the front, and I'm not sure if it's plastic or glass. It's cold to the touch. I'm pretty sure it's going to be glass. But, you know, I wasn't able to determine what it was exactly. But for the most part, it's a pretty good showing, and as long as you keep it clean, it shouldn't interfere with the laser's operation. And of course, you have all your warnings on the other side of the tool, your control panel on the other side, but we'll talk about that more here in a little bit. Yeah, for the most part, it's a pretty solid showing. I don't really have any major complaints, and everything seems to work just fine. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the control panel, and it's a pretty simple layout for the most part, but there is a little bit of a learning curve, and it took me a little while to figure out exactly why they designed it this particular way. Now, for the most part, it's a pretty simple layout. There's a single button, and to cycle through your different modes, you will simply tap the button, and you will be able to cycle through the 3 different modes. Of course, your 3 modes are going to be, you know, vertical, horizontal and vertical, not in that particular order, but those are your 3 different modes. And then, of course, if you want to lock the laser in place, you have a large red slider switch below that you can, well, basically slide it forward when it's in the lock position, and then it'll be in its leveling mode. And then, of course, when you slide it backward, the laser will turn off. Now, there is a reason that the laser turns off when you go from the unlock position to the lock position, and why that's the way you turn the laser on and off. It's in order to protect the pendulum arm on the inside of the laser from rocking back and forth or becoming damaged or becoming misaligned when you transport, because you want to make sure that it's always in the lock position when you are moving the laser for long periods of time, or when you're driving around with it. You know, any sort of excessive movement could cause the laser to become uncalibrated or to become damaged. So that's why they want it to basically always be in the lock position when it's not in use. And that's the theory behind why the power switch doesn't turn off the laser. It's the slider switch. And of course, that does make logical sense. It just makes it a little bit mystifying if you're not used to it. Once you get used to it, it's a pretty simple setup, and there really isn't much else to say about it. Now, when the laser is completely level, when you're in the leveling mode, the control panel will have a green light to let you know that, well, it's level and you don't need to worry. Now, of course, if the laser is not level when you're in leveling mode, it will turn red, and the laser itself will flash red, or slowly flash red. So, you know, it'll turn on and off, basically. It blinks. And, you know, it's a pretty useful little system there. So, you know, it is a self-leveling laser up to a point. Of course, it can't compensate past a certain point, so you will have to make sure that your tripod is level, or at the very least that the laser on top of your tripod is level, and that's why I recommend using a ball head, because it's a lot easier to work with than a standard tripod. So, like I said earlier, it's a pretty simple layout and design, but, you know, it's not exactly the most simple thing to figure out once you first unpack it if you've never used the laser before. So, with that being said, I'm pretty happy with the overall control panel layout. You know, there's not 50 gazillion different settings. and it has everything that a basic laser needs to have. There are more complicated lasers out there on the market, but they're generally more expensive than this particular laser, and the ones that have more features than this particular laser that are cheaper don't typically have a removable battery. So for the most part, this is sitting in an interesting place within the market, so your choice will have to basically depend on what your needs are. For me, I really like having the removable battery, so that's why I went with this particular laser, and I don't use a laser enough for me to justify buying a super expensive one. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the battery slot, and for the most part it's a pretty good showing here. The battery slip fits into place nice and securely, and there is next to no looseness or play to speak of, so quite frankly it's a good showing. This tool is compatible with the larger 4Ah battery, which I wasn't sure about when I first purchased the laser because it didn't really look like it would fit, but it does fit and it does work. So no complaints about battery compatibility. Runtime is going to be fairly decent, although I would recommend having a secondary battery just to be on the safe side if you are planning an all-day project with this particular laser. So with that being said, I don't really have any major complaints about the batteries or the battery life or the battery slot or the runtime, and everything here gets a pretty good, well, score for me. So with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about the weight of the tool. Okay, without a battery, the laser weighs 379 grams, which is about 0.8 pounds. And with a 1.5 amp hour battery, it weighs 556 grams, which is about 1.2 pounds. So it's a fairly light little laser. Okay, let's go ahead and talk briefly about this little laser in use, and I'd have to say for the most part it's been a pretty good showing. Now, something to keep in mind that this little laser is definitely not designed to be used in direct sunlight or on sunny days, and even on cloudy days it can be rather hard to see the laser lines outdoors unless it's incredibly dark. So, you know, plan on using this laser either in the early morning before it's super bright out, or in the late afternoon or evening once it's getting dark. So, and then you should be able to use this particular laser outdoors if you are using it outdoors. And of course, do not point this laser up if you are using it outdoors. And of course, if you are using it in a sunny room, well, you may have to block the window or draw the curtains or shades in order to be able to see your laser lines. But with that being said, you know, in most scenarios when you're indoors, this little laser will work just fine, and I don't really have any major complaints. It has all the functions that I need at this moment in time, and it came in at a price tag that was affordable for me to purchase. So, you know, quite frankly, I've been pretty happy with the overall functionality of this particular laser, and I really do love the fact that you can swap the batteries out. Now, the self-leveling function will only be useful up to a certain point because the little pendulum on the inside of the laser can only correct for so much of an error in, you know, the level, and you will have to make sure that your tripod is fairly level to begin with for that function to actually work. But it does help, and it does take a lot of the guesswork out, so that is an incredibly useful little function that this particular laser has. And of course, it does a good job of letting you know when it's too much of an error for itself to correct. So, you know, I really think the usability of this particular laser for novices is absolutely, you know, just fine. This definitely isn't going to be able to meet the needs of a more professional, you know, individual who might be needing this for a large job or just need to be super accurate. But, you know, for my own personal needs of, you know, putting up roosting bars or just making sure that the shelves are straight and level, that the pictures are level, you know, just all those little household uses, this particular laser definitely comes in handy, and I have enjoyed using it. So for the most part, I've been pretty happy with its overall functionality. So with that being said, let's recap with the pros and cons, and then I'll give you my final verdict on this particular laser. And the first pro is removable battery. Having the ability to swap out the battery if it's dead will come in handy, and of course, you know, it's never charged when you need it to be charged when the battery is built in. So quite frankly, this is definitely a pro in my opinion. 3 modes. 3 modes is about perfect for what I need. Of course, there are more expensive lasers in the market that have more modes, but for me personally, this is more than enough, and it gets the job done for my needs. Rubberized body. There is plenty of rubberized texture that wraps completely around the tool, so you should be fairly safe if you were to drop it. Of course, I would not recommend that, but you know, it is nice to have a little bit of an insurance policy in place. Self-leveling. Of course, this will only work up to a certain point, but it is very nice to have, and it will definitely save you some time. So quite frankly, this is definitely a pro in my opinion. Battery life. Overall, I've been pretty happy with its overall battery life, and I've been able to finish up several different projects and not have the tool die on me at any point. So for me personally, while the projects weren't incredibly long, it's been more than good enough. So in my opinion, the battery life is a pro. And the first con would be the price. It's not really that big of a con, but for me personally, I think if it was another $5 or $10 cheaper, it would be a far more appealing option and a little bit more competitive against some of the other lasers on the market. So with that being said, let's move on. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this little laser. For the most part, I'm actually, pretty happy with this particular laser. It's definitely not going to be the cheapest tool out there, but for a laser with a removable battery and 3 different features, and, well, just for the build quality, I think it is fairly well priced within what I would pay for it brand new. I think if it was $10 cheaper, it would be a far better option and be much more competitive, but it is what it is. Now, I do recommend buying a ball head tripod to use with this particular laser. You will need a tripod of some kind in order to get the most usability out of this particular laser, and there are plenty of different options on Amazon for you to choose from. For me personally, I picked up a tripod that was I think it was about $35, and it's been working fantastic for this particular laser. So, it just depends on what you need and, well, what your situation is. If all you have is a cheap old, leftover, point and shoot tripod from the early 2000s, it will work. It's just a lot more irritating trying to get the laser completely level when you're on uneven ground with one of those tripods where all you can do is adjust the legs. So, ball head tripod definitely makes this laser far more user-friendly. So this little laser comes recommended as long as you're happy with the price tag of $50, and you know that it's definitely not going to be the most, high-tech laser on the market. It's more than good enough, and it will pretty much accomplish all your basic jobs around the house. So, it is what it is. So with that being said, this little laser comes recommended. And that is it for this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we will see you all next time. God bless.